Hello, this is an RPG a Day 2022 recording. At time of recording, it's August 7th, and this is a combination of days video, which is going to take us from today, August 7th, through to the 13th of August, Saturday. And it's going to comprise the following questions, or, well, today's prompt. Today's prompt is called System Sunday, and it asks us to talk about something cool about a system that we like. Okay. Day 8, who introduced you to RPGs, which is a question that I think many will believe we've already answered on day 3, but we haven't. Question 9, what is the second RPG you bought? And I imagine this one is going to be difficult for people to answer as it is lost in the mists of time for the older players, and for the younger players, maybe they haven't gotten there yet. 10, when did or when will you start game mastering? Day 11, if you could live in a game setting, where would it be? 12, why did you start being a role-playing gamer? And 13, how would you change the way you started playing role-playing games? So that's what we're going to cover in this video. And of course, we're going to try and keep it brief. And of course, those of you who are familiar with this channel, I will be certain that that brevity effort will fail. Let's find out. On the written blog and on the podcast, there are two different versions, two different descriptions of this cool thing that I like about settings. And those who are familiar with this YouTube channel are probably expecting it's going to have something to do with ubiquity, and you would be right. And the system element, the mechanism that I've chosen, is the style points. And I'm picking this kind of as our segue out of the week 1 sub-theme of introductions, right? When I was first introduced to the Ubiquity role-playing system, the one thing that I was hesitant about, liking everything I was reading in multiple Ubiquity-powered games, was style points. I just had a reaction. Not a considered reaction, just simply a bias based on nothing, no foundation. Had a bias against the idea of these meta currencies. It wasn't that I hadn't had any experience with them, but I had some experience with them. Not enough to dislike it out of hand. Not enough to be certain what, if anything, I would dislike about it. What I love about the way that this works in Ubiquity is that style points enable the player to enter into a positive feedback loop with the other players, including the game master, about their representation of one of these pulp characters, regardless of whatever game we're in. They're supported in their play of their character when it is met with that sense of recognition, that sense of enjoyment, that sense of appreciation around the table. And, because genre is rule 0, and if you don't know what I mean by that, you can find out on this channel. Because genre is rule 0, this becomes the way that play through the players shapes further play for the betterment of play for those players. So the style point mechanism reinforces character. It reinforces genre. And, like with some other games we've talked about in the past, it can do so without needing to be spoken about. Play itself, conversation in character itself, doesn't need to stop in order to invoke this mechanism. Style chips, style points, style tokens, a tick mark on a piece of paper, right? Fingers raised can simply represent the passage of style points, right? Either an award from the game master or as a usage of a resource by the player. We slide the poker chip across the table and we take the extra dice that buys. I also like the idea that this use of this meta currency comes before the roll. So we're taking a risk, we're exerting, we're pushing a little bit harder. We recognize that we need to go a little bit farther than probably we can. And so drawing on the momentum of playing that character well earlier in the session, we leverage that confidence, we leverage that emotion, we leverage that dedication into more dice to attempt this gamble, right? This risk and reward cycle. And that in itself is fun. Will the extra dice pay off, or will, fate intervene? All of this is handled, the earning and the spending is handled through description, which is a watchword around here, is one of the things that we like. So the way that this silently, without needing to stop and say, you know what, I think I'm going to spend some style points. Is it okay if I spend some style points? And, well, I don't know, doesn't need to happen. It can simply be a part of the decision process of what you're going to do. I like that a lot. So that's a cool part of a system that I like. If you want to know more about that, you can check out the written blog or the podcast where we go into greater detail. For day 8, who introduced you to RPGs? Well, I talked on day 3 about when I was introduced, which was in 1983, and a friend of mine, we established a tentative friendship, and then finally the invitation came to play Dungeons and Dragons. So who was this guy? Well, this guy my own age, and he was, at that point in his life, trying very hard to be the funny guy. So it was easy to notice him in class. He liked learning. He didn't particularly enjoy school. He was experimenting with a lot of things, like I was myself. Like, what kind of music do I really like? Why do I like this song on the radio, but not that song on the radio? Why do I roll my eyes at this crazy 80s fashion, but kind of think that crazy 80s fashion is all right? And, that kind of stuff. We were at the beginning of our teenage years. And to me, who had moved a lot, who had depending on where I lived, had been the shy kid, had been the really small kid, been the really thin kid, had been the insider, had been the focus of attention, and had been the outsider, had been beneath attention. I'd been all of these things, and in this new town, I was finding myself having difficulty even wanting to go through that process again. And my friend was very welcoming. He wasn't an outsider. He wasn't an insider. He was in a transitionary stage himself, and he started me on the process of figuring out how to live in this new town. He was very empathetic, and he had a good understanding of fun. Like I said, he had a great sense of humor. And so play was challenging because that's how it had been introduced to him by his brothers. But at the same time, play was exciting. And he wasn't interested in having the dungeon masters. We were playing D&D. He wasn't interested in having the dungeon master's role be mysterious or authoritative. He was interested in the dungeon master's role simply being the secrets that you haven't learned yet. And so he was quite transparent with how you are a dungeon master. He was not insistent, really. That's the wrong way to put it. But he had a certainty that everybody who played would be dungeon masters too. That it wouldn't be just one person holding these books, close to the vest and keeping everything secret. It wasn't like that. And I think maybe this is the influence of, wargaming in his family. It wasn't that there are secrets at the sand table. It's that there are challenges to be overcome. There are situations to be recognized and dealt with. And that's what play of D&D was like with him. And that's really who he was. Honest, forthcoming, empathetic, and encouraging. That's who he was. So, who introduced you to RPGs? A person who was much more outgoing, much kinder, much more confident than I was myself. And in that relationship, I learned a lot. What is the second RPG you bought? This is a slightly difficult one for me because I remember going out and buying my first non-D&D game. Right. This is after I had decided that I was done with D&D, before I had purchased any game to go along with that decision. We'd been playing a lot of games. So what am I going to buy? Am I going to buy one that we have been playing? Like, am I going to buy Star Wars? Am I going to buy Top Secret? What am I going to get? What am I going to get? I ended up opting for games that we hadn't played yet. And what I settled on was a choice of 3 games on the rack at the friendly local game store, which wasn't all that friendly, actually, near where I went for the summer vacation between my first year of university and second. There was Arcanum, there was Palladium Fantasy, and there was Call of Cthulhu. Right? Palladium Fantasy, 1st edition, Call of Cthulhu, 4th edition, and Arcanum as Arcanum. I couldn't buy all 3, and I couldn't afford to buy even 2 of them together at the same time. But I made the decision I was going to buy Call of Cthulhu, and I was going to buy Palladium Fantasy, and that I would go back for Arcanum. And all that turned out to be true. I did buy Call of Cthulhu 4th edition. I did buy Palladium Fantasy 1st edition, and I went back for Arcanum. But Arcanum was gone. I never saw it again, and I never got to play it. Now, I bought Palladium Fantasy on that day because Call of Cthulhu was $1 more than I was carrying. So I bought Palladium Fantasy, went home, got more money, went back, got Call of Cthulhu, and then later, after getting paid, I went back for Arcanum, but by that point, it was gone. So it's kind of complicated. What was the second RPG I bought? It was to be Call of Cthulhu, but I was foiled. So it was Palladium Fantasy. But the second game that I ran of my own, right? Not second game that I ran, beyond D&D, ended up being Palladium Fantasy, and the third was Call of Cthulhu. All right. When did or when will you start game mastering? As I've mentioned many times in the past, my second session is when I started game mastering, and we switched off duties, and then we started our own campaigns, and we started playing on different days. And so some days going to school, we were playing in my world, and some days going to school, we're playing in his world. And then as we met more people and our circle expanded, these schedules changed. But right from the very beginning is when I started game mastering. And I'm glad I did. And this is an attitude that I like to share with people that I introduce or reintroduce into the hobby. It's definitely having that circle of players and game masters, I think, is a healthy and interesting and vibrant a way to play. Day 11, if you could live in a game setting, where would it be? This is tough. Jason Connerly of the Nerds RPG Variety podcast mentioned in his approach to this question that most of the game worlds that we talk about are pretty awful places. They're places with problems, and I definitely do not disagree. But if I were to stay myself with the skills and abilities that I have, and the physicality that I have, and were to be transferred into a game world, I would want many of my own particular skills to be of value, and so that I could survive there. And it would be a world where my outlook, my beliefs, my dreams had relevance. And so a world like Paul Wiggy Wade Williams' representation of France in All for One Régime Diabolique would be at the top of the list of the horrible worlds to which I would like to go. There are things that the Musketeers can do, that I've spent a long time learning how to do. And there are attitudes that they hold which are near and dear to my heart. There are attitudes that they hold which I also despise. And, that too is important, to be able to rise up in support of the things that you value and be able to stand in opposition against the things which you despise. And so I think if I were to live in such a setting, that is the choice I would feel compelled to make. I might come to regret it later, especially as disease and tooth decay and all that other stuff starts to set in. But maybe I'd have the great opportunity to die before all that terrible stuff happened. Well, 12. Why did you start RPGing? Why did it stick? Why did it continue? That kind of stuff. Just the hobby in general, not in a particular game. Well, I didn't recognize it at the time, and I'm still kind of struggling with it now as an older man. But there is a certain creative drive. And I thought when I was younger, maybe I'll be some kind of writer, or, maybe I'll go into video game design, or maybe, some kind of creative pursuit seemed tempting and possible, but also at the same time too far a goal to strive for. And I've never particularly felt all that creative as an individual. But looking back over my life, I see that most of the things that I focus on involve a certain kind of creativity. So why did I start role-playing games? I think this is just a natural outlet. And, maybe as a role player and having that outlet, it prevented me from pushing through some kind of barrier into some other kind of creativity, some other kind of pursuit. But I have no regrets. The friendships that I have made, the enduring friendships, the great memories, and all the skills that I've learned as a result of, being a game master, being a player, I wouldn't trade these for any, maybe of an unrealized past. And day 13, how would you change the way you started role-playing games? Like I just said, there's really nothing I would want to change about role-playing itself. The one thing that I'd want to change about how I was introduced to it is that I wish it could have been in the open. I wish that the foolishness of the Satanic Panic had not touched so many families and caused so many people to be, forbidden outright from playing. And those of us who continued to play secretly, were then cast in the roles of, disobedient children and liars. And while that kind of struggle against parents, that kind of struggle against society is a necessary part of growing up, it's also an unfortunate part of growing up. And it would have been nice to grow up in an environment where I didn't have this particular struggle and my friends didn't either. And I can be very thankful, while it might seem like that part of my childhood is overly strict or overbearing. Fortunately, it didn't extend into all parts of life. So when I discovered that I liked heavy metal and met the shock of parents as a result, "Oh, you're not going to play that crap in my house," kind of thing, I said, "Well, why don't you listen to it?" And they did. And they listened to it. They said, "Well, we don't like it, but there's nothing wrong with what you're listening to, so go ahead." And that was that. And I wish it had been that way with Dungeons and Dragons and the games which followed. I think it should have been. And that brings us to the end of RPG Day 2022 for this second composite video broadcast. There will be daily posts continuing on the written blog, and there will be irregular releases on the podcast. Part of this has to do with my schedule, and part to do with not wanting to contribute to the deluge of posts. It's fun to be able to see some cool posts every day. But as it won't be possible for me this time, I'm going to embrace the other side of it and this kind of posting. So I hope that's okay with everybody. But until the next time, take care.